John chapter 18 verses 28 to 38. John 18:28 to 38. Then the Jewish leaders took Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. By now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanness they did not enter the palace, because they wanted to be able to eat the Passover. So Pilate came out to them and asked, "What charges are you bringing against this man?" "If he were not a criminal," they replied, "we would not have handed him over to you." Pilate said, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." "But we have no right to execute anyone," they objected. This took place to fulfill what Jesus had said about the kind of death he was going to die. Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "Is that your own idea?" Jesus asked. "Or did others talk to you about me?" "Am I a Jew?" Pilate replied. "Your own people and chief priests have handed you over to me. What is it you have done?" Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But now my kingdom is from another place." "You are a king then?" said Pilate. Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into this world was to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." "What is truth?" retorted Pilate. With this he went out again, and to the Jews gathered there, and said, "I find no basis for a charge against him." Second reading, Luke chapter 23, verses 11 and 12. Luke 23, 11 and 12. Then Herod and his soldiers ridiculed and mocked him. Dressed him in an elegant robe, they sent him back to Pilate. That day Herod and Pilate became friends. Before this they had been enemies. The third reading, Matthew chapter 27, verses 15 to 26. Matthew 27, verses 15 to 26. Now it was the governor's custom at the festival to release a prisoner chosen by the crowd. At that time they had a well-known prisoner whose name was Jesus Barabbas. So when the crowd had gathered, Pilate asked them, "Which one do you want me to release to you? Jesus Barabbas, or Jesus who is called the Messiah?" For he knew it was out of self-interest that they had handed Jesus over to him. While Pilate was sitting on the judge's seat, his wife sent him this message: "Don't have anything to do with that innocent man, for I have suffered a great deal today in a dream because of him." But the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowd to ask for Barabbas and to have Jesus executed. "Which of the two do you want me to release to you?" asked the governor. "Barabbas," they answered. "What shall I do then with Jesus who is called the Messiah?" Pilate asked. They all answered, "Crucify him." "Why? What crime has he committed?" asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, "Crucify him!" When Pilate saw that he was getting nowhere, but that instead an uproar was starting, he took water and washed his hands in front of the crowd. "I am innocent of this man's blood," he said. "It is your responsibility." All the people answered, "His blood is on us and on our children." Then he released Barabbas to them, but he had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified.
So I think there are a number of things that people say so that they do not have to believe in Jesus, in the good news of Christ. And the most popular one, I think you can hear it just about everywhere. It's like the modern paradigm on life, okay? People who are religious or not religious, they say it. People in Asia, people in Africa, people in America, everyone seems to say this, and that is, there are no moral absolutes. And so you often hear this in conversation, well, that's true for you, but I have my own truth, right? I have my own truth, and my truth is, not only is it equal to yours, but it's the only one that's binding upon me, right? Whatever I believe, that's the only truth for me. Your truth doesn't exist. Your truth doesn't bind on me, per se, as such. But you're welcome to hold it, just don't talk to me about it. And so often this sort of statement, right? You have your truth, I have my truth is the real truth, it's just for me, and you just do your own thing. It's often to silence a conversation and to stop people dead in their tracks. If you've ever tried to share the gospel and got this particular reply, well, there's not a lot you can do, right? I mean, you just feel like there's not a lot of distance you can go on this one. And so you end up, if you try to debate on this, well, is that absolutely true? I mean, it just seems to go nowhere. Now, what does this have to do with the Bible? It turns out that this idea about absolute truth, this notion that, you know, there's no absolute truth and that therefore my truth is really the only truth that matters, is not new. And the first time we really read about it in the ancient sources, it's this gentleman that we're looking at today, Pontius Pilate. And so Pontius Pilate, he's this notorious villain of the New Testament. He's responsible for crucifying Jesus. Okay, he allows this to happen, quote unquote. He washes his hands, but it's ridiculous. It's really, he's allowing this. And in the middle of this whole interaction, we hear him say this word to Jesus, these words, "What is truth?" And what he means by that is, let's not have a hypothetical situation about what truth is. Your statement of what truth is not true to me. I get to decide what truth is, and it's not that, so let's be done with this conversation. Now that statement by Pilate is really a great statement for his life in general. And so let's ask some questions here. Let's begin to look at Pilate. I think at his life per se, you know, what did it look like? And I think we'll see through negative example why this idea of truth being relative is really quite toxic. I wouldn't want to believe that. And it leads me into trouble. So who is Pilate? So the first thing is Pilate isn't really his name. Pilate just means it's a certain class in Roman warfare where you're really good at throwing the javelin. It's kind of a high up rank where he would throw the javelin. Likely he would be on a horse. So it's kind of a horse javelin throwing warrior. That's his backstory, quote unquote, in some sense. Now the name Pontius is his last name. We don't have his first name in any of the sources. But this was a very well respected group of people in Roman society who happened to have been, just a few generations prior, enslaved. So if you look at Italy, you had Rome and all the places that it was ruling, and just up the coast there was the Tamite people, and so the Romans went and they conquered the Tamite people, and they enslaved them and brought them to Rome. But this particular group of family, they used this. They said, we're noble warriors. They rose through the class. Pretty soon they were out of slavery, and they began to have all of the hallmarks of success in Roman society, and they held some of the highest offices there. And Pilate has done the best of them all. Okay, so he's not a king, and yet he's been assigned kind of like a king. And so actually his title is perfect. His title is perfect. And what the perfect does, I have a picture that hopefully I'm going to glue into this video that has that Latin inscription that we found for Pilate, and that was found in Israel, and it says, it gives him the title perfect. And what the perfect does, they're basically a glorified warlord. They only have one job, and the one job that they have is that whenever there is somebody rebelling against Rome, whenever there are people who want to say, no, Roman, Caesar isn't king, I'm king, they massacre those people. That's their only job. Get rid of all the rebels. And the reason for doing that was to keep feeding the the fuel to Roman Empire, the money, you see. This is how Rome operated. They went and conquered people, and then they set up taxes, and then off of that money, they continued to have this system where they'd hire more mercenaries and go and defeat more people. Roman warfare was basically a business venture. And Pilate was part of that, you see. He was the governor of Israel, but what that meant, per se, is that he just executed a lot of people who wanted to rebel against Rome. That was his job. So basically, what we're learning about Pilate is he's this glorified warlord who's risen through the ranks, probably through subterfuge and these different ways that people do, and he's spinned things, and he's gotten to the top, and he's brilliant, and he's also brutal. I mean, he does his job well. So there's three sources that mention Pilate. There might be more, but the three main sources are Philo of Alexander, and Tacitus, and Josephus. And they all mention Pilate's brutality. He is brutal. Two of them, by the way, Josephus and Tacitus, mention that he executed Jesus. And so outside of the Bible, it talks very clearly about Jesus' execution from these outside sources. And these are not happy sources. They don't believe in Jesus, but they mention it nonetheless. But anyway, he's brutal. And so he periodically goes and executes people here, there, and everywhere. There's tons of stories of all the brutal things he does. In the New Testament, some people approach Jesus and say, "Did you hear what just happened?" And he says, "No, what?" And some people were sacrificing in the temple, and in comes Pilate, and he slices them up right there, and their blood mixes with the blood that they were offering. Just a shocking story, but not unique for Pilate. He's got lots of stories like this, and you can read about them from Josephus. You can read about them from Philo of Alexandria, and a bit from Tacitus too. He is brutal. He's so brutal that, in fact, eventually even Rome can't stomach it. And so they call him back and they forcefully retire him. But if you think about it, his brutality is all about maintaining his own image. It's not that he cares about anybody. This is the thing. He comes to Israel and he's willing to slaughter anyone for his name and his own glory, and especially to maintain his position. Because if enough people rebel, then he loses his job. And so his response is, "I'll be as brutal as I can be, and I will be as merciless as I can be if it makes me look better." Now, as horrible as all that sounds, I think that we can see, Pilate. Okay, so Pilate is a narcissist, but you know what? There are shades of Pilate in all sorts of people. There are shades of Pilate in us. When we are at our worst, we're basically thinking about ourselves, and other people, we don't even care. They're secondhand, and we're not even considering them. Last little boy about Pilate so far. Because he's perfect of Israel, he's responsible to appoint the high priest. That's what the Romans said. You appoint the high priest. The high priest would then give him a ton of money, and he would take that money and give a huge chunk of that back to Rome, because that's the system. And so Pilate, you're going to see in a moment, we have the high priest, that is Caiaphas, and his father-in-law, Annas. And these guys have paid Pilate for the privilege of being high priest. So they're his business associates. So, when the crowd comes to arrest Jesus, we're told that the Roman soldiers are there too. We go, what's that about? Well, because they're business partners, they were given Roman soldiers to accompany them. And Pilate uses the high priests and the leaders to make sure that there aren't any rebels and to weed them out. And so basically, Pilate is acting on a tip here to go get Jesus. Pilate's acting on a tip. So that's Pilate's background. The critical day of his life came when he encounters Jesus. Let me give you a bit of background on the events that go on here. We've already began to talk about this a little bit. So Jesus is in Jerusalem. He's in the temple. A high priest comes to try to tell Jesus to stop saying what Jesus is saying and stop leading people the direction that Jesus is leading them. And Jesus says, well, let's talk about it. And they begin to talk, and Jesus just humiliates the high priest and humiliates the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Everybody is left dumbfounded. They can't respond to this man and to his amazing works. And so they say, well, if we can't beat him, then murder him. Not join him. If we can't beat him, murder him. And so they plan to secretly take Jesus, or to take out Jesus when nobody is watching, because all the people love this man, but we hate him. And so they conspire with Judas, okay? But then they go along, and a huge multitude of people show up at the Garden of Gethsemane. It's actually the winepress of Gethsemane, which would have been an enclosed area. So that's how Judas helps them. He helps them to get into the gate, and he helps them to find Jesus. It's this enclosed area, and this huge multitude of people carrying bats and clubs, and also Roman soldiers show up. And then things don't go as planned. Because number one, Jesus doesn't come out and say, fight, 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 fight. Okay, he doesn't start a rebellion. He turns himself in. And this undoubtedly saves all of the disciples' lives, okay? But it's a surprise. This guy isn't starting a rebellion. He just turned himself in. And more than that, he says, they come and they say, are you Jesus? And he says, I am. It reminds us of the Lord's name, which means I am. And they all fall down flat. And then they get up, and he says, I'm Jesus, so if you want to take me into custody, you may just let these go. This isn't a rebellion. And so it's even more confusing, and that seems miraculous. And then, even further, one of the men takes out his knife and slices off the high priest's ear, which would have been a sign that they're saying, you're in the wrong high priest, okay? So that's what happened. It wasn't just a wild swipe from Peter. He was trying to make a statement to the high priest. But Jesus says, you better stop that. And he heals Peter's ear. This doesn't look anything like a rebellion. So now, Jesus is taken into custody. Some bad things are happening. They're like, all right, let's take Jesus to Pilate, because Pilate is the only one who can give the death penalty. So they're on their way, and that's where I want to pick up our story. So if you have a Bible with you, let's turn to John chapter 18, and looking at verse 28. When the Jewish leaders took Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor, by now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanness, they did not enter the palace because they wanted to be able to eat the Passover. So Pilate came out to them and asked, what charges are you bringing against this man? If he were not a criminal, they replied, we would not have handed him over to you. Pilate said, then take him yourself and judge him by your own law. But we've no right to execute anyone, they objected. This took place to fulfill what Jesus had said about the kind of death he was going to die. He was going to die. So Pilate is at this point puzzled by Jesus, and it's very clearly the case. And it seems that the normal routine is that Pilate gave soldiers to the Pharisees and the leaders, and the soldiers, they reported back. And so at this point, Pilate knows that Jesus is not like any other rebel that he's ever seen. At this point, he knows that something is up. And so, instead of just saying, you guys do whatever you want, we're business partners, he comes out and he says, so what exactly is his accusation? And this is very unexpected for the leaders. And so they say, we only bring people who are bad people to you, so just please rubber stamp this already. And Pilate says no. Okay, if you don't have an accusation, you don't get anything. I'm certainly not allowing you to execute this man. And so there's this tension. Well, what's going on? Is it that Jesus is suddenly important to Pilate? Is it what has taken place? Well, to be honest, it really is all about selfishness for Pilate. I feel bad about this. Somebody said, please don't throw Pilate under the bus. But it's so easy to throw him under the bus because he's a wretched person. So the reason that Pilate is interested here in Jesus is because he senses a disconnect. Oh, wait a minute. This is the man who's not rebelling. And this is problematic for Pilate. Because, see, if Pilate goes ahead and just rubber stamps this whole situation, then what he's done is portrayed himself as a very bad judge. And that's one of the criteria of his job, to judge correctly, to be a righteous judge. He's not a righteous judge. He doesn't care about truth, which is why he says what he says in a minute here. But he doesn't want to look bad. And further, he really hates being played. He likes playing other people. He hates being played. Don't think that this is because he cares about Jesus. Elsewhere, and we read it this morning, elsewhere, what happens is Pilate talks to Jesus, and you can see he gets mystified by what Jesus has to say. He sends him away in irritation to Herod, and when Jesus comes to Herod, Herod wants him to do a miracle. Jesus refuses to do a miracle, so Herod has Jesus beat to bits. Just beats him up, terribly beats him up, and sends him back. And when Pilate sees how Herod beat Jesus up, it changes his perception on Herod. He's like, I like you now. See, they didn't like each other before because one narcissist can't like another narcissist, The country isn't big enough for both of them. They didn't like each other because they're both full of themselves to the highest order. But when he sees the way that Herod had Jesus beat up, he's like, yeah, we can be friends. He doesn't care one bit for Jesus. The only thing he cares about is himself. Okay. So this leads to an interrogation of Jesus where, funny enough, Pilate ends up interrogating himself by accident. Look at verse 33. Look at verse 33. Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "Is that your own idea?" Jesus asked. "Or did others talk to you about me?" "Am I a Jew?" Pilate replied. "Your own people and chief priests handed you over to me. What is it that you've done?" Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world." Okay, so Pilate names the charge, and the charge is that you're claiming to be a king, and there's only one king, Caesar. And since, if that's true, if you're claiming to be your own king and you're rebelling, then I should execute you. That's my one job, execute all the rebels. So are you claiming to be a rebel? And I like what Jesus does here. He actually says, are you being played? That's what he's saying. Are you being played? Did someone tell you to ask me that? Now look, Pilate will have none of this conversation. He's not interested in justice here. And so he basically replies to Jesus, listen, I am not a Jewish person, right? He's saying, I do not care about Jewish stuff. I don't care about this country. I don't care about the leaders. I don't care about you. He's mystified by the whole thing. He doesn't want to bother. He won't bother. He thinks it's all just junk, and he just has no desire to see truth and justice delivered here. That's his statement back to Jesus. Okay, I am not interested. What am I interested in? Myself, taking care of myself, making myself look good. And so he says, just tell me what you did already. Tell me what you did. And Jesus says, in response, it's really good. Jesus' response both answers the accusation, but then it also invites Pilate to a different world. Jesus is inviting Pilate to a whole nother way to see the world. So he says, my kingdom is not of this world. My kingdom is not of this world. And first off, that answers the objection, which is, are you trying to fight against Caesar? No, I am a heavenly king. But what it's saying is, I'm a heavenly king in a heavenly kingdom. Now, Pilate has received miracle stories already. He's received proof. He saw that the soldiers fell down, everyone fell down. He saw that someone's ear was put back on. Now he's receiving content about another world. Let me invite you, Jesus says, let me invite you to see a whole different reality. I'm from a different place, and that place is real, and I rule there. He's sharing the gospel. He's sharing the gospel. And look, he's going to continue to do so. Verse 37. "You are a king then," said Pilate. Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into the world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of the truth listens to me." So what Jesus is doing for Pilate is sharing the gospel. Now, I do not think that Jesus has any idea that Pilate is going to say yes. In fact, I'm pretty sure Jesus knows that this is going to be rejected. And that actually tells us something too. The good news of Jesus should not be shared only with people. We should share it with everyone, whether they're going to accept it or not. We should share it with Pilate. We should share it with Hitler. We need to share the gospel with whoever is willing to listen to it. That's what it tells us. Because Jesus is now sharing the good news. And the good news started with, I'm from another realm, that's why I do miracles. I'm the king there. And then we find out that this place is called a kingdom of truth. A kingdom of truth. Now, why did Jesus do that? Why did he talk about the truth? You know, so Pilate, he would have been schooled in Hellenic philosophy. And so as anyone who goes through that, it's all focused on truth. The Stoics, the moral philosophers, they were all interested in truth. And so Jesus is inviting him to see, and this is what all your school is leading to, Pilate, the truth, and it's about me, and it's about my kingdom. And then he says, all who follow me, all who are part of the truth, they follow me. And so he's actually offering Pilate a big, huge turn in his life. You can go on doing what you do. You can go on being the perfect here and being cruel and terrible and a horrible person, or you can start to hear the truth. You could start to believe in me. You could start to let that change everything. He's offering him the gospel. Pilate immediately pushes back. And there's our words in verse 38. Pilate responds, "What is truth? What is truth?" Now, Pilate isn't saying, when he says, "What is truth?" he's not saying, "I don't really think that anything is true." That's not what he's saying. He's saying, your take, your version of truth, your whole world system, not mine. I have a different truth. What is truth? What is your truth? You can't tell me what to believe. You can't tell me that something is absolutely wrong. I get to choose, and I do not choose anything from you. It's a total write-off. Pilate rebukes Jesus. He doesn't wait for a response. He gets up and he walks right out the door. This conversation is over. No one can tell me what truth is. But Pilate has a truth. Pilate has been showing us the truth. His truth. And his truth is it's all about him. Everything is permissible if it makes him better. That's his truth. But this is the defining moment of his life. We don't know when the defining moments of our life will come along, but there are defining moments, and this is the defining moment. Here's the gospel, Pilate. No, I don't accept your truth. I have my own. Ever argued with somebody, and as you're arguing with them, you think to yourself, I've got no idea why I'm arguing with this person. And you're arguing fairly vehemently. You're really getting into it. You're trying to produce evidence. But it's not because they're not right. It's not because you couldn't be wrong. It's because you've decided that that's where you stand. It doesn't even matter what the facts are. Have you ever argued and it doesn't really matter what the facts actually are beneath it? You just want to be right. See, that's Pilate's thought. What is truth? Who cares? It's all about me. It's a huge temptation for us. Huge temptation to think, whatever I feel, whatever I think, that's truth. I don't need to listen to anybody. I don't need to listen to God. There are no moral absolutes. Now, let's look at how things end, because Pilate's version of the truth kind of unmasked him as a total hypocrite. And so we read about this in the other reading. Basically, Pilate goes out the door and he's got this great plan to not execute Jesus. He doesn't want to execute Jesus. Why? It's not because he cares about Jesus. It's because he doesn't want to look like a bad judge. That's a reason that you could lose your job. Okay? He doesn't want to lose his job, being a lousy judge. And so he goes out the door and he says, listen, okay, yeah, sure, he's guilty, but I can just release him because it's a special time of year. And I'm really such a nice, kind guy. So shall I release him to you? And as he does this, they cry out, they write the no, release for us Barabbas, right? Release for us Barabbas. Now, that's really ironic. So first off, Barabbas, that's Aramaic for son of the Father being the Lord. So it's son of God, which is Jesus' title, okay? He calls himself son of God, Barabbas does. And he very well may have given himself that name, okay? So a little bit, already he's an egotist. He calls himself son of the Father, and then we're told that he is just the sort of person that should never, ever, ever be set free. He's murdered people. He's probably murdered Roman soldiers. He's in jail waiting execution because that's what he's done. This is a man that Pilate, as a good judge in his job, there's no way that he does anything else but execute this person. And yet that person, the one that is actually a problem for Rome, he goes free. And then this innocent man who's done nothing wrong, who is absolutely kind and loving and merciful, who's about to die for all of our sins, that man, no, he's going to get executed. It all happens because, see, Pilate is a hypocrite. Pilate is a horrible and terrible hypocrite. And this is why this happens. It's a picture from God. See, you claim to be about being a good judge, but then you let this terrible man off, and my one true son, you crucify him. You are false, and your own view of truth is hypocrisy. And then it gets worse, right? So there he is, and they all cry out for Jesus to be murdered rather than set free, which is a terrible, terrible thing. And what happens? As he's sitting there, he gets a note from his wife. He gets an email, as it were. At the very moment that he's supposed to be pronouncing judgment, he gets the email. And the email says, I've had a terrible dream. This Jesus guy is completely innocent. Make sure he gets off. Don't condemn him. Don't condemn him, whatever you do. Which, if you're anyone on earth, this is an indication that God is real, that he's really acting in the world, and that whatever you do, you need to not touch Jesus. You need to pronounce him innocent. But you see, Pilate can't. Pilate can't, because if he lets Jesus off the hook, the people will rebel. They'll go and complain to the Romans. He'll lose his job, and he'll lose his prestige. And it's always only about Pilate. And so Jesus is crucified. And it's very sad. And that last call, it's this unreceived grace from God, that dream. Unreceived. Continue on with the same stupid thinking. So what happens with Pilate, by the way? He likely dies a short time later, maybe 2-3 years after this. I say that because the writers seem to refer to him in the past tense, and some of them write fairly early after. It's likely that well, number one, Rome said, come back here, you're too brutal. And then shortly thereafter, well, we never hear from him again. So it was fairly short-lived, whatever he received from betraying Jesus. But Pilate shows us that personal truth can't we can hinder, the personal truth that we have, it can hinder us from the real truth. Our personal truth can hinder us from hearing the real truth, just like Pilate. Our personal truth can get in the way. So that's Pilate. He shows us that our personal truth can keep us from really getting the truth. Now, one last point on Pilate, and that is to say, even if you resist and rebel against God's truth ultimately prevails, and you're part of the reason that it prevails. Now, hopefully, to the right of me, maybe, you're going to see an image, and the image is of the Pilate lepton, is what it's called, the Pilate lepton. And that is a coin that Pilate had minted from 27 AD to about 34 AD, okay? And he was deposed in 34, at the end of 34. And next to it, you'll see the Shroud of Turin. Okay, now why are these two connected? The answer is the Shroud of Turin, I think, is the only real relic. It shouldn't be called the Shroud of Turin because it's mentioned as early as the 3rd century. I'm sorry, the 4th century in Spain. And what the shroud is it's a linen cloth from Israel, and on that linen cloth there is an image of a crucified Jewish man. And it's the man has really died, we know that. The man has really died, the man was really crucified, we know that. We have no idea how we have a photographic negative image. You can't actually see it with regular eyesight. You need a camera, and it's a negative image, and it's 3D. We have no idea how that happened, but everything checks out. And on that man, that crucified man's eyes, is the Pilate lepton. The Pilate lepton from 27 to 34 AD. So see, Pilate is a huge proof that Jesus is the way, truth, and life. Regardless of whether the Shroud of Turin is true or not, I think it is. Everything that Pilate does just reinforces that Jesus is the truth and the way and the life. So personal truth can keep us from really getting the truth. Don't resist God's version of the truth for your own. How can we apply this? I want us to read the Bible, yes, but let the Bible read you. The truth of the matter is we're not aligned with what God says, not entirely. But as Christians, we've gotten used to reading the Bible and simply glossing over anything that disagrees with our already preconceived ideas. When we hear hard things, we just say, oh, that was for them. Or we don't understand. Or we don't want to understand. We need to let the Bible shape our world. Let Jesus' story shape how you see the universe, because Jesus' story is the true story. And this happens every day for believers, and it's sanctification, where we let God tell us what's up, we let God tell us what the world is like, we let God tell us the truth, and the truth sets us free.